Record. There we go. All right. So welcome everyone. Here we have Celia from the Marine Foundation. We've got quite a few questions submitted already. Celia's had a chance to look at some of them, and we also want to bounce over to the people who've taken the time to show up here today, and we'll give you a chance to answer some of them too. And maybe we'll start with that. So if you haven't already submitted a question and you had something burning, we'll just open it up to the floor. Go ahead and unmute yourself and pose any just introductory question, maybe a general topic to start, anything that you're curious about Celia's work. Over to you. Go ahead, Hannah.
Hello, everyone. I had a question about kind of, and excuse the framing of this, but kind of the problem of basing things around ecotourism when then a lot of these island nations can be subject to hurricanes or something that could really wipe that out for a while, or like now we're seeing with COVID. And so are now these communities really suffering if they were too much based on ecotourism? So I'm wondering how to kind of balance that.
Well, hello, everybody. I mean, obviously, a lot of these projects were done prior to COVID. So, I mean, that's throwing everything a loop. Yeah, I mean, islands are definitely suffering hugely. I mean, you can look at it the other way, which is probably the reefs are very happy and the fish are very happy. There's always a positive side to a negative. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I was thinking about that actually, you know, when I was making these, re-editing these courses, because obviously COVID was kind of coming up just as I was working on that, and definitely kind of contemplated that idea of, gosh, yeah, you know, these islands are already totally dependent on tourism economically. And yeah, I mean, how do we navigate that as an issue? To be honest with you, I don't really have the answer to that. You know, I mean, my model was based on, you know, set up during a time where tourism was clearly growing. I saw an opportunity for the fact that, you know, here is a potential income stream to a community. A lot of the models that we were seeing where, you know, people set up hotels, you know, you never leave the place. So not huge amounts of money was actually making it to the community. So it was very much more a reaction to something that was kind of happening already. And how could we try and start turning that industry around? So, you know, the economic benefits started to spread themselves out a little bit more evenly amongst everybody. I think I did comment it. I think I did make a comment on it somewhere about just the fact that, you know, worst case scenario, we leave, you know, tourism breaks down completely. I mean, that's something that potentially could happen. At least through these projects, we have given some education. You know, we are leaving the community more informed, more empowered. You know, so I feel like, you know, we're only human. There's only so much we can do. Not many of us are destined to be Alexander the Great or whatever. So, you know, I feel by having gone in there and done the work that we've done, that was a good step. In fact, we were just talking before everybody came on about the reality of really needing to do something, even if it's not everything. Do something imperfectly rather than not do it because it can't be perfect. Do something small rather than not do it at all because you can't do something big. You know, solve a little problem in the moment rather than worrying about solving everything. So yes, but like a lot of what's happening here is, you know, you know, it's a stepstone. You know, you try and create one solution or try and explore a solution. You may even not come up with the answer, but at least through the process of exploration, the process of designing something, I mean, isn't that partly what the creative process is about? You know, the very process is creates intimacy between people. We communicate, talking. So that would be my answer. I don't know if it's necessarily answers your question, but, you know, it's a conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and thank you. And I just want to thank you so much for your work. It's so inspiring. And the marine life is the closest to my heart of all the ecosystems we're looking at. So thank you.
That's what's so fun about the marine environment. Anybody who is a diver or snorkeler is that, you know, if you are a lover of nature, you know, you can interact with nature, with wild animals in a way that you just can't do anywhere else in our planet. You know, they're not scared of us in the way that they are on land. You know, I mean, in land, you know, the average creature, unless it's been kind of tamed, in which case, you know, you're not really seeing it behaving in its natural ways. Whilst in the sea, they don't. I mean, you know, fish will come up and play with you, and I find that a real treat. That is a gift, you know. to be able to have that interaction with a wild animal is just incredible, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Celia. Thanks, Hannah, for the question. I'll just go back to, we've been gathering from the Moodle where everyone submitted, and I'll just give you a sort of frame. We categorize the questions, and we'll try and maybe stick with those themes. So obviously we've started with the impact, the behavior change, ecotourism, so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. There's also a lot of questions on stakeholder engagement. So that's a common theme that's coming out, and how you work with other partners, how you get authorities to approve. And then of course there's the practicalities. So there's some questions on material, some questions on how to become a coral gardener. So we'll go into those ones, and the specifics of the no-take zone as well. And then maybe we can end with the ones on conservation, sort of the bigger purpose of why we're all here, and the sort of, yeah, the movement of conservation. So yeah, any other questions on impact, on behavior change, on ecotourism? Does anyone want to raise any questions on those themes? Just unmute yourself and pose it yourself.
Yeah, maybe I can, if no one else has a question. Because I was wondering, maybe with regards to the impact, it made me think also that you mentioned that you changed your discourse for your funders. You were learning from that, and I imagine that these funders also always ask and talk about impact measurement. Is that something that you've ever considered or in any way done to somehow be able to say something about what the impact was of your work? I can imagine it's very complicated because a lot of other factors influence it as well, but I can also imagine that your funders want you to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely was what ended up making my projects really quite difficult to fund, because of the nature of the facts. I mean, all of them are difficult to fund, as I explained, but because mine was a kind of creative approach, you know, certainly if you wanted to have impact in terms of coral conservation, you wouldn't build a sculpture. Do you know what I mean? You'd put coral tables in, and you'd focus your endeavors on you know, maximum, you know, reproduction of corals. So it was quite complicated in that sense. So, you know, when we were looking at it, it was slightly different what those impacts were. So it was more to do with kind of employment of people in the areas, you know, just diving, and in general how the communities, you know, is much more about the kind of bigger community as well as the conservation endeavors. Because if you were just looking at my projects from a conservation perspective, it was a bigger picture than that. It was very difficult. But when I was in, I mean, I did a lot of work in Bali, and I ended up partnering with, you know, Reef Check Indonesia. Reef Check's a kind of huge global organization. So as I said, the longer I did my projects, the easier it was for proof of concept, you know. And when I first started working in Indonesia, you know, I'd work with NGOs. These were all scientists. All of them thought I was a bit batty, you know. And then I got one brilliant person. She worked for Coral, and she really was interested in what I was doing. So she then supported my endeavors, and then slowly but surely we started to get data around what we had achieved. So it was something that took time to kind of get the information that we required to really start building a case for what we were doing. And with the languaging, I mean, it was just, this is something that I think applied to question. I've actually, there's a website you might want to look at. I worked on a big European project with 15 European partners, and it was called responsible.eu. And it was just all about basically studying change, you know, and why weren't we changing? Anyway, one of the bits of information that did come out was that you have to, information isn't enough to make people change. If we were going to change with information, we would all be changing. So what they were then studying was that actually the information needs to be carefully curated to your audience. So this was something that, you know, when I first started with what I was doing, I didn't really know the languaging around it. And so I really started to refine that languaging, you know, depending on the audience that I was talking to. That was actually prior to being involved in this European project, but, you know, I could have, you know, that basically that's what came out of it. You know, this was a group of people ranging from scientists to professionals, and you know, it was pretty obvious, but clearly you couldn't talk to kids in the same way that you'd be talking to the shipping industry. So that's the kind of new ideas that are kind of coming out of it. You have to be very, very specific.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a observation that I'll try to end and turn into a question. You know, when we talk about impact, you know, when we talk about profit and loss and costs and all these different things, we can say that's a very linear way of thinking. But then if we say, okay, how do we measure the impact? And we just measure it as the amount of coral that we've rebuilt. And once again, we're kind of falling into that linear trap. And what I noticed from your project, Celia, and what I've seen with some projects where they intentionally sink ships and all that, is that you've got multiple, you can create a matrix with multiple layers of impact, where it's not just how much coral, how much biodiversity have you increased, but also how much attention to the cause. You know, you just talked about education, and just how much attraction are you bringing people in? Because I'd rather dive in an area with some of your sculptures than dive in an area that has just a bunch of, you know, sunken you know, concrete. You know, so I was wondering if there are other, you know, non-linear ways of measuring impact that you've seen through your projects or others.
I mean, I have a colleague in London, actually, Guy Battle, who has set up something called the social portal, and I can't exactly remember, but it's about definitely advising, you know, companies on, you know, he actually set up a carbon crediting company first. That was his first thing that he did. So kind of getting into the idea of, you know, offsetting carbon, and, you know, essentially it became like, you know, actually it was sold to companies because actually it profited them to become more efficient. The fact that the efficiency also helped the world as well was kind of a sideline, but, you know, good. And so now he has a company where they're trying to assess, you know, a company's profile based on what they're doing socially. So people are starting to try and come up with matrix, you know, around these kind of subjects. But yeah, it's quite difficult. You know, I mean, I tend to come from an intuitive perspective. So, you know, that's again why I got involved in a creative thing. I find it maybe quite difficult to verbalize, you know, but I mean, I'm just naturally somebody that kind of feels the group anyway, you know, but yeah, I'm just getting, at the moment I'm working on a project with Fabien Cousteau. You know, we've got the coral conservation element, but then he's also talking about sinking Proteus, which is this kind of underwater research lab. You know, it's kind of dual funded. You know, I suppose you could look at it from the fact that actually a lot of conservation endeavors now talk about having, you know, kind of multiple funding models, which would be a different way of looking at what you're talking about. So, you know, there's a lot of sense, people saying you can't just rely on foundations, you have to bring in a financial profit element. So, you know, yeah, it's a kind of subtle, complicated weave that I think is so unique bit by bit. But yeah, people are slowly starting to try and create a language around it. But yeah, it's an unfolding journey. That's why I think this course is so great, isn't it? Because, you know, you're looking at what people have done. You know, I mean, I wanted to do a creative project because I really, really believe that a creative environment enables people to come up with good ideas. I genuinely believe that, you know, if you make people terrified, they clam up and will probably go and buy something new, because that's how we all cope with not feeling very good. So, you know, I certainly feel like this kind of environment is creating conversation. It's making people feel inspired, excited. And I think that's where the new ideas are going to come from. So.
Yeah, I think another pattern that I'm seeing in some of the questions, you know, we're talking about stakeholders. So we've got financing, you know, the funders, other NGOs and different organizations that you might partner with, tourists, and then locals. And I wonder, there was a question about, did you partner when you came in? There's another question about how do you ensure that it's sustained when you leave? So maybe you could just walk us through the timing. You know, there's all these different stakeholders involved and you interact with them at different points. So how does it work as it unfolds from, you know, cradle to grave in terms of project idea, creation, implementation, and then handing back over? If you could talk on the timing.
I mean, we were never a managing body. So, I mean, I was I was a visitor kind of providing providing an element. So I was always looking for local managing partners. It's one of the criteria actually for one of my projects. I think there was also mentioned of where I locate it. So, you know, I have a set of criteria that I will only partner with people that have these kind of criteria in place. Over the time, I had some fairly unsuccessful projects, and that was based on the fact that the managing body that wasn't very effective, or the you know, the commitment of that community hadn't been refined yet, and we were kind of hoping that somebody would do something rather than you know, really kind of guaranteeing. So I always will partner with an NGO or a hotel. Those are the two main. Mostly I want both, but I will always only have, you know, make sure I have one of them that is existing within that community. They've got a history there, you know, they're well established, and they're basically not going anywhere. So I work with them. They've already, you know, set themselves up. They've already worked within the community. They've already got a vested interest within that community. The community's already established a relationship with them. I come in, offer an additional service. I mean, the best example of this would be in Permuta, and this is my favorite project, where the coral goddess is. Up until that point, they had quite a big biorock project, but, you know, the biorocks were fairly not the most, they were kind of creative a little bit, but they certainly haven't been taken to the level that I did with the coral goddess. You know, I went in, I worked with the team, I worked with the hotel, got to know everybody really well, and then after I did that, I mean, the sculptures that they now create, they were just phenomenal. So, you know, I inspired this kind of approach to what they were doing, and then these photographs of that project appeared all over the world. And my kind of moment of glory was when it appeared in the Bali airport. You know, the big sculpture was there because, you know, I did want these projects to help promote that conservation project and help bring them money, you know, so that we start to feed into that idea of this being a successful model. Therefore we start to feed into the impact, you know, and it's that kind of, you know, accumulative results. So yeah, I mean, and then, I mean, I had such wonderful examples. So with Permuta, and I then did a project in East Bali. I was then able to bring in the kind of head of, because they work very much in these kind of banjars. It's quite a different set of kind of infrastructure and governance that they have in Bali. They're quite locally governed. But then I would take that one person from that one project, then, you know, when we did the ceremonies at the other location, they would then come. And so then we start to share skill and confidence, and they feel motivated to set in, you know, a series of activities where they might not really understand why they're doing it, but they have somebody, you know, who's 3 years down the line speaking to them in their own language. And that was really helpful as well. So yeah, I mean, when I was first starting, I was kind of, I suppose I was just kind of quite lucky, you know. I did meet some people that were super into the idea, really. So I mean, my first place that I really worked was the Gili Islands. That was where they ran the biorock workshops. But yeah, I mean, for me, I then leave. I mean, I have regular contacts, and I go back and see my projects, but, you know, I'm relying on the fact that there's people locally that are going to keep an eye on them and look after them. It's like a gift. They're almost like the kind of ultimate forms of public art, I think, you know, in the sense that they're kind of gifted to the community, and then it's really kind of up to them how much they can, you know, take advantage of that project, you know, how much they look after it and photograph it. And some are better than others, really, at just using what we've given as a tool for themselves, you know.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Celia.
just ask additionally onto that, because the question was also a bit about timing, so this makes it clearer to me. But then, just like the first, like in timing wise, the first step, did you like identify a spot and then look for stakeholders who you could work with, or was it more that there were stakeholders in a certain spot that said, hey, we want to do something here, or we heard about this great thing Celia is doing, let's try and give her a call and see if she wants to come over?
Well, I mean, I started by going into the diving industry. So I became a scuba diver and worked my way up to becoming a dive master. So I was already, you know, kind of diving and involved in the tourism industry, but from the diving community. That's how I kind of accessed in. And obviously when you're in that community, especially when you do a dive master, because you're now moving into kind of a semi-professional level, which I did in Costa Rica. So when I was doing my initial research, I was moving between Costa Rica and Bali. Those were the kind of two locations. And, you know, when I was in Costa Rica, and this is the kind of conversation that comes up a lot. And I mean, part of the reason I even decided to do this project was because of the fact that I was diving, and I was diving shipwrecks. And then during that time, I was also starting to learn about artificial reefs. And then as an artist, I was a bit like, oh, okay, you know, this is something interesting here, you know. So by being, that conversation was already there, people within the industry were already quite excited. I was actually going to stay in Costa Rica, but then in 2008, the industry completely collapsed in Costa Rica because of the recession, and everything that was, and Costa Rica was super dependent on, you know, on the economy of the US. And during this time, I was trying to weave my first kind of projects, but actually with Costa Rica, which is very good, but their licensing laws in terms of what you can put in the sea are much, much higher than Indonesia. So, which is a good and bad thing, you know, but so I ended up going back to Indonesia and doing research there, which involved me going to different dive sites and diving. And then I started to specifically focus on locations that actually were already doing coral conservation projects. And the one that I came across in Bali, which is how it all started, was with BioRock. I then signed up for a course on Gili Tuang and studying one of their BioRock conservation projects. In fact, somebody asked on this course, how do you learn about coral gardening and coral reef restoration? So that's how I did it. I went and did a course. You know, you can also do volunteer work. I mean, a lot of the volunteer organizations around the world, you know, you can go along and do coral gardening with the volunteers as well. And then, yeah, once I was doing this course, I mean, I tell you what, to begin with, honestly, I was paying other people to let me do stuff, you know, to kind of get a sculpture in the ocean. So I just said to them, you know, I'm doing this course. Would anybody be interested in doing a sculpture instead of just kind of some standard shape? And the owner of the Gili Eco Trust, Delphine, said to me, well, look, if you can persuade any of the dive shops, because actually the structures were being put in front of dive shops and were being allocated to either a hotel or a dive shop to manage, or in terms of BioRock, provide the electricity that technique uses. And so I did, and then a couple of the places said, yeah, we're up for sculpture, and I did the first manta BioRock. So that's kind of how it started. And then then somebody else in Premier was like, would you like to do something there? And then, you know, meanwhile, I was kind of contacting NGOs. And so, yeah, I mean, it was just network, approach, no. And then suddenly, as I said, you know, there was people that were interested, and just things started to happen. So I don't know if that helps in any way, but by telling you that's how I approached it. Yeah, and then now I haven't got a project in Costa Rica. It was just proving too difficult. Now I'm starting to move into the Caribbean a bit, where Indonesia's licensing laws are, you know, there's nothing that they need to do there, really, to be honest with you. As long as you've got the community backing, then you're fine. But in the Caribbean, where we're starting to work more now, there's much more licensing requirements. So.
Steve, did you have one? Just unmute yourself.
Unmute. Here we go.
You go.
Yes. Hello. I want to congratulate her with her work, because I actually did my dive master at the Gilites.
Oh, did you?
Yes,
Fun.
I did. Yes. Yes, I did it there. Yes. So when diving,
great place for it. Great place for it.
Great place.
Yeah.
So I've seen all your situation inland as well, the trash and the scout grazing on top of it, and it's like that was like, I'm happy I'm a vegan right now. I don't have to eat that because. Really. Yes. I was having a question. How did you go about the implementation of the no-take zone with the authorities, or was it just on a local level? Because I know the authorities and the culture is really great, but the authorities there, all the paperwork and getting something done from is really hard. So,
I mean, and then as you say, you can spend all that time on the paperwork, and you know, if it's not implemented, then you know, I mean, I was talking to somebody in the Caribbean recently, and they were just saying, that, you know, you set in a no-take zone, but then the value of the fish goes up. So then the desire to actually go and steal it becomes even more profitable. So, you know, we're really caught up in a very tricky situation, in truth. But yes, I mean, I found, as I said, because I wasn't, you know, I came across a lot of resentment actually in communities from the bigger, you know, more international or national bodies coming in and trying to manage a local community. I mean, actually England recently they were trying to do some stuff in England a few years back. And I mean, the local community is like, really find it offensive. Do you know what I mean? You know, you're telling me I can't fish, you're telling me I can't do that, you know, you know, this kind of top-down authoritarian approach, you know. So yeah, again, as I said, I worked locally with people. A lot of the places I worked, actually, there was so little fish left, to be honest with you, that it wasn't particularly hard to set up a no-take zone. I mean, the fishermen were kind of suffering, so, you know, they were quite keen in many ways to start doing that. But yeah, I would like to see, I mean, I think there's just huge room more for, you know, marine spatial planning is the thing that really is this idea that is starting to happen, but is really probably one of the ideas that I think if I was going to retrain, I probably would like to do something like that. I find that fascinating, you know, and then it requires buy-in from everybody, you know, just a real acknowledgement from the community and an understanding. I mean, essentially, I mean, I think that's something, again, in bigger picture stuff that we're all learning now, the idea of community, this idea of having to work together, having to potentially sacrifice. But yeah, it's still in process. I saw people break the law. I did see people, I was never gonna judge anybody or try and implement any law on anybody, because it just wasn't my job. It's so complicated. These people are so poor, you know. I mean, it's just, I mean, so yeah, we did our bits. We did set up these small areas. People do start to see the fish come back fairly quickly. So again, this idea of, you know, when we took somebody from one place and then got them to speak to the community, you know, definitely having in Bali, having a Balinese, they're kind of called Pak Prana, they're kind of the leaders of the communities. And he'd set up a hotel, and then having him going and speaking to the other community and speaking in their own language and sharing with them, you know, you'll do this, you'll see rewards. Do you know what I mean? This is not some outside person again coming in and telling you what you should do. You know, we really believe in this, we've really benefited, we've made money out of doing this as well, you know. So it's lead by example, education, you know, and basically and basically encouraging a community to self-govern. I mean, again, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the kind of nanny state and this idea, but, you know, really actually the opposite. I mean, in truth, I believe that we need both. I mean, if we're going to move on to discussing like industrial level fishing, I mean, the truth of it is local fishing really is irrelevant in terms of industrial scale fishing. So when we're talking about a no-take zone where I'm dealing with, we're doing with a little local coral reef and a few locals going in with a line and net, you know, and the biggest damage they're really going to do is, you know, breaking the coral and maybe stealing a grouper, which is not ideal, but mostly they don't have any grouper left. Do you know what I mean? So the really big thing is the industrial fishing, which is another whole kettle of fish altogether, you know.
Exactly, because I saw this week in the news then about the PMAs in England, in your fisheries, that big trawler ships were allowed to go fishing in a PMA, and it's like, yeah, because they're not really breaking the law. It's like, yeah, but it's not really a PMA, then is it if they catch, but I mean, coming from abroad and taking all that fish out, that's there's some boat levels, and
I mean, it's insane, you know. I mean, I saw there was a documentary recently, it was on the fishing in Cornwall of the sardines, and, you know, which is the West Country of England, you know, it all starts, you know, they all got like, you know, what's marine conservation labeling for sustainable catching, you know, but I mean, the economic pressure even on the sustainable fishery just becomes a piece of the pie, and then before you know it, even a sustainable fishery is already being pressurized into becoming something that's not that, you know, and then before you know it, the whole thing. So yeah, I mean, this course is certainly about dialogue and trying to find answers, because the answers certainly aren't fixed yet, you know.
Thank you.
I mean, I just think let's make management and coral conservation and you know, policing fisheries really cool. Give them really good uniforms and really good boats. Is the internet okay? Is the internet failing a bit?
No, we've got you. It's all good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Cool. I mean, definitely there's a lot of emphasis throughout all the practitioners of the social element and the engagement element. And certainly when we get to the final module where we're doing design work and the participants of the course are going to work together, and you need people, like we're doing it for the nature and we are part of nature. So there's certainly that element. maybe we
the
can
biggest problem with conservation is people. I mean, you know, that's the biggest problem. In every job I worked in, I mean, that was essentially the key factor of it. I mean, we are the problem, isn't it? So, you know, it's taken us a while to create this mess, so I imagine it's going to take us a while. But yeah, definitely. I mean, always when I went in, that was the problem. Egos, and you know, even if, you know, we all know that this is what we should be doing, but people don't do it. You know, people get kind of caught up in their egos, or want this or want that, and then some people just even make trouble just because they want to have a voice. You know, I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, people feel so silenced and so disempowered, you know, that then people then express that through all sorts of distorted ways, you know. So I mean, that's one of the things I felt was like, how do you really empower? I mean, for me, empowering people is the key. You know, they said a lot of conservation up to date has been completely the opposite of that. You know, you go in with money, you make everybody dependent on you, and they even talk about kind of, you know, international funding being kind of like a kind of modern day colonialism. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there's some books about that, this idea that you're helping. I mean, even that is arrogant in and of itself, isn't it? That you can go in and tell other people how they should look after themselves. They wouldn't have the problems if it wasn't for the West anyway. So yeah, I mean, for me, empowering local people and actually in some ways, you know, making ourselves, I mean, that was actually kind of ironic with a lot of my projects, as I kind of went in, thought I was going to have some great business model. Anyway, it proved to be a complete failed business model, because I would leave and then they build their own sculptures. But then that's in itself is a success, isn't it? You know, you've handed over a good idea. But yeah, kind of the twists and turns of it all, you know. So, you know, but then that's what empowerment is, isn't it? Is you offer something up to a community and let them, you know, take it where they will. So
yeah. Maybe we'll shift gears a little bit into the technical side of things, but Celia, also when we were just starting the call before everyone joined, we thought we do want it to be a dialogue. So you don't have to have a question. If anyone here joining the call has ideas for engagement, or wants to share an insight that they have and invite Celia's feedback for it. Just another second to pause here on any other thoughts on the social element of this kind of work.
One thing that just hit me with what Celia was saying about making enforcement cool is, you know, the costs. If you're a fisherman and then it becomes a no catch zone, then the costs increase, and so you've got these different incentives. You know, there is an additional industry there in terms of the enforcement side that is available. So I think, you know, that's not necessarily something that we can impose, but, you know, if you look at the externalities, you know, the cost is paid by all the community, so it makes sense the community would create jobs to help, you know, enforce those laws and all that. So maybe that will be an additional positive in the future. That's all I have.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw locals, you know, implement their law in their own unique way. You know, sometimes they didn't do anything because that's just what they felt. Other places they did go and do something more, you know, and go on boats and, you know, take away their fishing equipment. And yeah, and I think one of the best ones I had was with the dynamite fishing in Indonesia, there was a fisherman, he'd lost his arm. You know, he'd blown off his own arm, and he went around kind of basically educating people on maybe why they shouldn't do dynamite fishing. So that was probably a good way to tell people not to do it without your arm, you know, kind of like, yeah. You think you're catching things, but actually you're losing things.
Wow. Okay, maybe then we'll switch over to the technical stuff. So some of the questions, you know, how was the coral sourced and propagated? How did you choose the sites for your sculptures? How close were they to existing reefs? How long did it take to establish the site? So just maybe walk us through some of those technical ones, and just for your reference, I'm on point 2 there. So
okay. Yeah, so I mean, I can go through this. So one of the things is what the precise activities of a coral gardener and what areas did their training cover. So I mean, we worked with the idea of fragmenting, which was this, you know, where you basically coral gardening works on incredibly similar ideas to a garden. which is that, you know, you in a garden, you want to provide the optimum conditions. So coral love sunshine, they love to be at a particular depth. It's very similar to like seedlings, which is that, you know, when you first plant your seed, everything's going to grow super close together. And then actually, if you want the carrots, for example, to mature into an edible carrot, you're actually going to break them up and then you're going to plant them separately. So this is kind of basically, in essence, what coral gardening is about. You know, you take the corals, you know, and then you put them in an optimum condition, which is going to be a nice sunny environment, a good depth, and then you're going to break them up, separate them so that they then will grow. They'll basically will grow more quickly. So, you know, for me, this is this idea that now a human being, instead of having a destructive relationship to the ocean, is now moving into something more of a kind of guardian. So we can actually now use our expertise and our knowledge in a beneficial way to actually enhance coral growth rates and enable and be proactive in helping support that reef ecosystem to kind of grow back more quickly. So fragmentation was two ways that we did it, which is, I mean, one of the best ways is that you take broken fragments that you'll find over the reef. You know, corals can be broken by waves, they can be broken by boats. If there are snorkelers and divers around, they can flip the, you know, the coral with their fins. So the best thing is just to take the bits that are broken, like kind of manage a reef. You'll also, if you're dealing with a destroyed reef, you'll have a coral rubble bed. So you actually may find babies in the coral that have turned over. So you might want to take those out. That's the most kind of most low impact form of fragmenting. The next layer up that people I did work with did, which is where you actually take a piece of coral and you actually a coral head, and you actually now break this down into smaller bits. So you'll actually break a piece off a bit of coral, and then you'll break it into smaller pieces. Then there's various techniques as to how you fix that onto a structure. You know, biorock was a technique that we used where we used electricity. This did a reaction with this ocean where on metal, the electrolysis process actually made the calcium carbonate, which is what coral is, grow around the metal, which then fused the coral to these structures. Other people, we mostly use ties. I use ties. Other people use epoxy, some kind of glue or resin to fix it. And then you have all these other different types of systems. Some of them you have these kind of hanging nets. I mean, there's lots of different methods being used. These are just the ones that we ended up using. Different structures that you can put them on. I've never cultivated corals, although I am about to work on a project with Fabien Cousteau where we are going to be cultivating. So that's going to be interesting for me because I've never actually worked with cultivating corals. We have just been managing an existing reef habitat and working with what's in that system rather than introducing new corals into that system. So I'm intrigued by it. Fabien Cousteau thinks that his methodology is that they think that if you are reproducing and you know, growing them in tanks, actually they're more resilient. And then there's other, you know, also just that a lot of the corals that you are going to find fragmenting in the ocean will just be of a particular species. So you're not creating a particularly biodiverse selection of corals. So he's also talking about the fact that by cultivating, we're working with somebody who does it within aquariums, you are actually going to help enhance the biodiversity. And I think also for me, what's potentially interesting about this route, and you know, something that my projects were always about trying to kind of facilitate research, is in terms of trying to mitigate climate change and the effect that climate change is going to have on the coral reefs. You know, enabling projects where we can research what corals are going to be more resilient. You know, are there going to be particular strains that are going to come through that are going to be able to stand the higher temperatures and the bleaching events? So I think that's something else that will also be an exciting thing to be able to explore through these projects. So yeah, that's really, has anybody got any questions about that? I mean, I think somebody asked me about books and stuff like that, but I mean, I literally did it. I worked with people, I don't know. I mean, I haven't got a particular book that I've read, for example, on coral. There may well be one out there now, but mostly I did it from research papers. There's a really good one. There's lots of volunteer organizations around the world that are all doing their own little thing. So yeah, and I just researched, and then I ended up working with people. For me, you know, I was very clear, I'm not a scientist, I'm an artist. So I was always going to partner. I was never going to be the one to lead a methodology. I was always going to let somebody else lead that methodology for me.
There's another question that just came in. Sorry to interrupt you. Just from Gio. I guess it's more of a personal thing for you, Celia. Like, how do you deal with the frustrations initially when you've got such a grand idea and you're like so passionate about it and it doesn't move as fast as you're hoping, and you know all these roadblocks come? And we talked in our cohort group about how much we actually do want to hear about the failures. You know, it's great for you to talk about, we did this and we did this, but it's frustrating, it's not easy. So share with us some of like how you manage that and keep your hope and keep going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard work, you know, huge amounts of effort on my part, you know. I mean, I was always felt so encouraged by the people I had around me, you know. I mean, I was, you know, I did work with amazing individuals, and you know, both from the local. I mean, I was just blessed with such wonderful experiences. I think that always kind of pushed me through. I mean, some of the ceremonies that I experienced in Bali, where, you know, the entire community came and blessed sculptures, and it was very moving for me. And, you know, clearly I was motivated by passion. So, you know, if logic came into the equation, it might have been a different story. But certainly, you know, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, as I said, one of my funders and my main inspirers was Anita Roddick, who set up the Body Shop, and she was always, you know, she had wrote a book, Business is Unusual, you know, and which is a book I'd highly recommend reading if anybody feels like reading it. And you know, she just talked about how you know, she was so, at one point she was completely terrorized by somebody who just wanted to annihilate everything that she'd done, you know, but it really did do amazing things as a company. I mean, it really was a pioneering company in terms of, you know, we're talking in the 80s, they were dealing with recycling, they were dealing with fair trade, you know, they were fighting for the destruction of the rainforest, and yet she was so criticized. So, you know, that's why I come up with this idea of like, you know, perfection doesn't exist. You know, the mistakes are gonna happen. They're hugely disappointing. But I think when you kind of get involved in the process more, rather than it having to be a particular outcome, you know, I mean, when you're putting a sculpture in the ocean, I mean, you're not in control of a massive storm that's never hit that beach before ever, you know, and knocks the thing over. But I saw, you know, all of this is a kind of galvanizing. I mean, my thing ended up being ultimately that this was all about galvanizing community and dialogue, you know, in some sense. The rest of it eventually became kind of secondary, really, you know. And so if something went wrong, actually that became an opportunity to bring the group together to discuss a solution. And so that, in essence, was the most important thing. You know, I was going to bring people together, let's create solutions, makes people reinvest in their environment. Ultimately, I learned, you know, wasn't going to make the same mistakes over and over again. So I stopped. I learned from that. So, you know, like I said, when a project wasn't managed well, and I mean, I did this one brilliant project with Deus, which is, I don't know if anybody knows Deus. It's a kind of biker surfer brand, uber cool. I mean, they have shops I mean, we'll talk about super good. You've got motorbikes and you've got surfers. I mean, you couldn't get better visual branding, even if you tried, you know, kind of cruising around the Outer Hebrides of, you know, islands with their surfboards. And we just did the most amazing project with them that was brilliant. And then with the Gili Eco Trust, they ended up locating it in a place, and it just disappeared. It just didn't get managed, and it was such a missed opportunity. I felt so upset by that, but you know, you move on, really. And you know, so I think for me, you know, my great takeaway was obviously passion drove me. So I probably would have made a different set of decisions if I wasn't driven by my passion. And that equally, yeah, it was very much more about better to do something than nothing was definitely my call, you know. You know, Anita Roddick again she just got so gnarly, and I did get people criticizing me a lot as well, and that's where that kind of idea came from, really. You know, just better to do something than not at all, and just to learn from your mistakes, and try not to take it so too personally. It was a bit difficult.
Thanks. I'll open it up to the floor again. Anyone have other questions to chime in on that theme? We've got about 15 more minutes left. Go ahead, Hannah.
I was just curious with your project with Fabian, where you guys are looking to do that. Is that going to be in the Caribbean, or you said you're going to sink
Yeah.
a research station? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, anybody that wants to kind of be involved, I can spread the word out, but because it is a pretty amazing project what he's up to. So yeah, I mean, Jacques Cousteau was famous for these underwater kind of research labs. I think it's kind of disappeared off the kind of main agenda. So yeah, they're doing the latest version of it, and they're planning on sinking it off Curacao in the Caribbean. So they've got permissions to do it there, and you know, Fabian is quite. I've only met him recently actually, so he's quite the character, and you know they're all about the aquanauts and the idea that we know more about space really than we do about the deep sea. And certainly this, I mean, Sylvia Earle was also a big one about, you know, by having these underwater labs, you know, you can stay in the ocean diving for, you know, extended periods of time. You know, you're always obviously dealing with the problem if you're diving, you have to kind of come up all the time. And yeah, so he's really excited by, you know, the research, what we can find down there. And then higher up, they're doing this kind of fairly innovative coral restoration project where they are partnering with an aquarium guy from New York who is already cultivating, growing corals for aquariums, which is kind of an interesting, you know, partnership. And then they're actually going to set up a facility on the coast in Curacao where they're going to cultivate the corals in tanks, and then they're actually going to 3D print the kind of tiles. So this is going to be a different methodology. At the moment, 3D printing is being done mostly with ceramic, which corals. One of the problems with using concrete and stuff like that is that the corals don't like to settle immediately. So you have the other element of coral gardening, which is rather than actually kind of, you know, actively planting them on, you just allow settling, because one of the big things in a damaged reef ecosystem is this rubble bed that I'm talking about, or sand. Neither of these are very good for coral to settle on. So by providing a substrate, you know, the corals can settle. But the concretes, they take a bit of time. They don't like settling on the concrete. So they provide a kind of an alternative purpose, really. So, but ceramic is really good. And what Cousteau's are planning on doing is actually making the 3D printing from limestone. So they actually have a lot of limestone on the island. So these tiles will then be 3D printed, and then the corals will be propagated onto those tiles. So, and then as part of that, I met them and was like, well, my thing is particularly I love to put goddesses in the ocean. So because of the Africa being, and so it's just to bring it's to bring this kind of lighter tone into the project. You know, something, you know, not everybody's obviously going to be able to enjoy the Proteus. So let's provide something that's kind of more fun and visual, and again can kind of create some kind of visual material that people can enjoy. So yeah. More than welcome to share.
I was just going to say there's another question in there about, you know, apart from sculptures, and see what other forms of art did you use in your restoration. So you can just say, you said photography, music, dance, you know, just, this is question 17. Other opportunities to blend the arts, the sciences, and the social, you know, humanities.
I mean, you know, when I did the thing with the EU, you know, it was very clear that science, there's only a few people that can handle science information. I mean, science just goes whoop over people's heads. So, you know, for me, the creative approach was very much about kind of trying to sideline the brain and allow, you know, human beings absorb information in so many different ways. And so, you know, the creative arts are certainly a way of absorbing a huge amount of information actually without ever saying a word. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, in terms of actually, I mean, I don't know really what I would put into the sea aside from sculptures. I wouldn't. I mean, I know somebody who did a photographic show on a wreck, you know. So, I mean, but I mean, in terms of my interpretation of that was that photography was a huge part of what we did. So, you know, the representation of the work, videography was another huge part of it, so that we could take these take these sculptures out of the ocean, because obviously not everybody's down there. And so I would say photography and videos were a huge part of what we did. And then when we had events, we had music and people wrote songs. And I personally think music's one of the most powerful ways. But I don't know, that's what I loved about Sculptures in the Sea, is I loved the fact that it was a real direct partnership, clear partnership between creativity and science and conservation. That I could present, like when I was talking about languaging, I could present it as a purely fluffy, creative project to one person, whilst to somebody else I could talk about the science and the conservation, and then to somebody else I could talk about, the benefits to your hotel by moving into a more environmental subject. So that's what I loved about it. I loved the fact that, I could engage with people in a fairly light way, and yet actually what was happening behind it was very solid. And that, for me, as a person with integrity and somebody who really passionately wanted to do something that was doing something rather than, there's a lot of talk going on, there's a lot of this happening, and it was very important that sitting behind this was something solid, something real, something, that you could establish an impact for. And then and if somebody wanted to ask me a question about that, I could very clearly turn around to them and say, what the benefit of it was. So whilst I don't really know, I'd love to hear, has anybody else got any ideas of how creativity could be applied in a very direct way? Has anybody got any thoughts on that? Without it being more representational. For photography is more representational, isn't it? Whilst, the living sculptures in the sea is a clear collaboration between a science and art. Well, just a thought.
I had one more question that answers that. I would love to be in touch with you to invite you to be a guest on a podcast series that I'm launching at the end of this month called Architects of the Future, where we go into the future 10 years and talk about the success stories. And so what does this look like in 10 years? And what were the steps that were taken to get there? And just really trying to frame to people the benefits of the work we're doing with the regenerative efforts now. And so that's just one creative outlet that I would love to collaborate with you on.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that's a good example of a podcast of how, we can disseminate the information out. I'd love to be involved. Wouldn't it be great if we could vision the future of what we want and then take the steps back to now of what we want to do,
Yeah, that's the whole idea. So yes, I would love to be in touch with you about that. And
okay, great.
I also really want to get into virtual reality filmmaking so that we can go diving and experience this, but have people not just see it in 2D, but to really experience it. And then, like Cousteau said, we protect what we know, what we love, and what we see. So, yeah.
In fact, you're saying that, you do remind me of some projects that I got involved with right at the beginning that never which was like kind of gaming stuff. At one point I tried to work with a gamer, to kind of try and do that, where you could actually, swim down to the sculptures, and certainly in terms of trying to kind of, explore kind of a funding model, where you could kind of go in and plant a coral, or that was one thing that we played around with. But these, just so much money is required to really take these into the kind of next phase. And then another thing I really wanted to do was put cameras down with that. So yes, just have fun to try and, as you say, to bring more people into that world as possible and to experience that. One of the things, I don't know how many people are divers here, but one of the things, aside from the fact that, you can interact with marine life in a way that you can't interact with animals, there's the other thing of the feeling of being able to fly, isn't it? And so I've been working with a sculptor recently in the Caribbean, and I was explaining to him, this is going to be an opportunity to create a sculpture, that can be witnessed in a way that you can't do on land. You can approach it from above, you can swim down, you can swim around it. And I'm sure in virtual worlds, there's going to be some fun things to explore there.
Yeah, because that would be, you say that would be expensive, but then in a way it's also kind of cheap to get people down under the sea, because right now the diving industry mostly is focused on foreigners, because it's very expensive, because the local people don't have a chance to go diving or witness that. So once the technology would be there, it would be amazing to show those in classrooms, little kids and all that, and they can actually see what's in front of their doorstep, all the beautiful creatures, and like I experienced before as diving, because the locals almost never see that. even
Yeah.
or picture on some movies. But you know, that virtual reality would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, in Indonesia, I mean, they hated swimming. I mean, they wouldn't even, you know, terrified of the water. So, you know, it was fun to do these projects with them because we use local fishermen and their skill to sink the sculptures. And I mean, I can imagine that these people are like, it must have been so fun for them to come, the sculpture arrives and they help sink it. And, but then they see the photographs, you know, under the water. So yeah, I mean, all this is contributing to a change in perspective, isn't it? You know, change of awareness. Suddenly they see Westerners coming in who kind of care, that kind of makes them interested, and they see the sea in a way that they've never seen it before. So yeah.
Did you ever try and make a time lapse of one of your statues being covered, slowly being covered by the coral? That would be really cool to see how it goes and how it like.
I know. I mean, I think the coral goddess is probably the most recorded. So, you know, I get great amusement out of kind of Googling these things on the internet and seeing what photographs come up. So actually the coral goddess, we've got really quite a good set of records from her from when she first was sunk to where she is now. And I just love seeing all the animals living on her. It's super fun to see all the fish, and then, you know, like the coral reef is a little bit like a garden and a forest, you know, different birds and different fish move through, like the birds have moved through the forest. You see the kind of herbivore fish kind of cruising through her in the morning and nibbling on her, and yeah, but yeah, I'd love to do something like that. Would be fabulous. Time lapse is an interesting. Has anybody done any time lapse photography? I mean, I tried to do it on some of my other artwork, and you have to be very precise, don't you? No change of light, otherwise it all starts to do weird things. But I'd love to do that. It'd be amazing.
It's difficult in the ocean because I think they tried it on chasing coral with the time lapse, and in the end it didn't work with the cameras leaking and all that. And then they just went to do it manually every day with a picture. It took them like 3-4 months to just every day for the bleaching that was. But yeah, I think it's complicated in the ocean to get it anchored and get it all.
Yeah, exactly.
There's one more question there in the chat, Celia, and then after that one, we'll take maybe one more before we close on the hour. So yeah, are your sculptures always single, or do you have any series of installations?
Yeah, I mean, the Permuteran is I think there's like, I don't know how many structures there's in the water there. There's like 50 or something. They've got a whole kind of area of, I just have the one there. And then in East Bali, I've got about 4 in that one location. Gili Eco Trust, I did lots of projects with them. I don't know, maybe I did 10 to 15 on the Gili Islands. I've got another big project just outside Bunaken Reef in Indonesia, where we're just building a whole dive site there, and we're kind of adding more to it now. Those aren't necessarily, those are actually sculptures that we actually brought that were already made out of stone. So yeah, and then the one in Curacao with Fabian will be something we'll keep adding to. So yeah, so quite a few. I've moved from England to the US 5 years ago, so that's why Bali is incredibly far away from the USA. It was a much easier journey from England, so that's also why I'm quite interested to kind of start to move into the Caribbean. The Caribbean, I think somebody asked about settling. I thought just an interesting question, just an interesting point. Like the Indonesian Ocean is super vibrant, and so, you know, I have watched those sculptures kind of grow much more quickly, whilst in the Caribbean I'm very interested to work there, because I have to say I haven't seen nearly so much kind of coral life in that area. I don't know if that's just because they just didn't have the extensive biodiversity that they once had in Indonesia, or it was actually just because the health of the systems have declined so much. But I have a sculpture in Belize, and it's been down for 5 years now, and I don't think there's any coral growing on it. There's a little bit of like some seaweed on it. So I'm going to be interested to work in the Caribbean and just see how that differs. I think probably it's just been really damaged, but I mean, I know that Indonesia is part of the Coral Triangle, so it's, you know, amazing biodiversity, and that's why it's famous for its biodiversity, I think, because of all the volcanic activity in the area, and it's just phenomenal. So, but yeah, very different growth rates in different parts of the world.
Yeah, thank you. Any final questions? We'll hover for a second, and then Celia, any final comments from you? Anyone that submitted a question on the Moodle, we've taken notes, and so Celia's been very thorough. So if it didn't get expressed here or verbally and you put it in the Moodle, then we've got it written as well for you. So do we have one more question here? Go ahead.
I was wondering how you deal with non-native species. I myself am a guide on the Waddenzee, so I guide on the intertidal zone, and it's all sand and silt and mud, so there is no species that grow on the rocks, etc. Not native species, or just a few, and there's coming more and more, non-native species with the ballast water, etc., into the waters. So I was wondering how you address that in your previous projects.
It's in fact, I mean, so the project I worked for was responsible.eu, and one of the big subjects was invasive species. I think it was at the blue mussel. There's a mussel in Europe that's just completely gone insane. I thought it'd actually be quite fun to do an art installation where you kind of sunk things in the sea and then kind of pulled them out, because they're literally, these things just cover absolutely everything and form a complete monoculture. I mean, it's really bad. I mean, I think, did you answer the question about the lionfish, or was it somebody else who wrote that question? Because there was a comment about native species, and they specifically mentioned lionfish, which is an invasive species in the Caribbean, and the question was, should we eat them? And I was like, yeah, eat lionfish. They're really yummy and we need to get them off the reef, you know. So and also that question was also about, should we bring in other species? I always worry about the idea of bringing in another species to control something else. But it was interesting because this was a big topic that came up in this big funding program for the EU, and you know, one of the big things was basalt water. Obviously not necessarily my area, but clearly something that is relevant. And how do we implement change? How do we make sure that the boats, you know, don't take their waters, and how do we manage that? So, you know, that was very much that ended up being something that was very much considered an industry solution, you know. So it ends up being that solutions ended up kind of breaking down into different sectors. So definitely that's an industry solution. We need to make sure that boats, you know, don't dump water in various places, or at least there are filters that you should be putting on your system, so that when you do dump the water, you know, you don't release anything into it. But yeah, I mean, I think invasive species are going to become an increasing problem, you know. I mean, on our projects in terms of coral gardening, you know, like a garden, we had like management measures. So, you know, in a garden you go in and weed and in some ways, you know, the fact that we are having that impact by doing coral gardening, it's not a natural system, you know, not that natural systems are really totally active anymore anyway, because the very presence of human being is breaking down what is considered a natural functioning system, which would regulate itself. So we are seeing much more predators because of the breakdown in that system, which then makes it even more vulnerable to invasive species. But yeah, I mean, on our projects, there's something called a drupidee, which is a little shell that eats the coral. So actually every day the coral gardeners would go out and remove the drupidees, you know. Some of the structures you actually want to take the algae off, because there's no herbivore fish in the water, so the algae becomes dominant, unnaturally dominant. And then crown of thorns are a kind of huge problem, but you have to be very, very careful at how you extract a crown of thorns, because it turns out that if you hurt them, actually they release like billions of eggs. So you have to be very careful about how you remove them from the water, so they don't actually just go and release tons of eggs. So yeah, I mean, definitely we need to manage the industry and make sure that we're not exacerbating the problem through transporting stuff around the world. And then I would imagine the most important thing would be to try and build up the natural immunity of the reef, you know, just build up, you know, try and help that ecosystem become as strong as possible. The invasive species are more of a problem because of the fact that the systems are weakened as well. So but yeah, this is all part of the kind of globalization, and yeah, we're seeing some really big impacts from that. What have your thoughts? Have you come up with any thoughts on how to deal with it, or do you think you should bring in predators and stuff like that to try and?
Well, definitely don't think you have to bring in other predators, etc.
Yeah.
No, well,
Yeah, no,
you know, I have lots
somebody
of
said
thoughts.
that in one of their questions. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, not me. I don't know. I don't have any thoughts about it. It makes our work a bit more interesting because we have oyster beds where we go and scavenge around, and you have a lot of sea squirts, which are fun.
I love sea squirts. Yeah, they're super fun.
Yeah, they're I think I love them most from all the creatures I know of in the sea. No, it's just that, yeah, I was wondering how your thoughts were about that topic. Yeah.
There was one question here that somebody talked about mangroves, about how important they were, you know, and so I just wanted to say that, you know, with coral reefs and mangroves, definitely kind of completely symbiotic, you know, they definitely kind of exist in the same places. They totally are kind of reliant on each other. And so a lot of mangroves aren't nearly such a kind of, you know, people don't like mangroves so much. They're actually epically beautiful in terms of the trees, but, you know, they kind of tend to be ruined. They're silty and kind of mosquito-y, and, you know, they're certainly not your pristine sandy beach. But the question was whether, you know, mangroves were an important ecosystem to focus on. And I was like, they really are. I mean, the evidence coming through now of how they're a carbon sequencer is just vital, and they protect the beaches from erosion. So, you know, what you're seeing happening in areas where the mangroves and coral reefs are declining is you're actually starting to see an increase in erosion on land, which I find quite ironic, because in somewhere like the Gili Islands, you know, suddenly people might want to restore their coral reefs because now their land is worth so much for tourism that actually once they start to see like a kind of yard of their beach disappearing each year, they might be motivated to try and keep it. But yeah.
Cool, we've got one more question from Adib, and then we'll finish off there just 10 minutes after the hour. Go ahead.
Hi, Celia.
Hi.
I mean, really amazing work. I enjoyed the module a lot.
I
just wanted to ask you, I'm from Lebanon, and, you know, I go diving around here, and it's just, I mean, there's absolutely nothing left. So I work in forest restoration. So we usually go to a pristine forest, we study, we identify the species, you know, and then we replicate that in the site we're working in. But here I can't even imagine like where to start. And even there isn't that much, you know, like literature. There's a lot of literature on land biodiversity done hundreds of years ago in books, and, you know, everything's documented, but nothing about the sea. So I like, any tips on where to start?
Gosh. I mean, are there? I mean, well, if you dive, that's a great place to start, because, you know, the divers know the water really well. You know, I mean, yes, chatting to older people is always an interesting thing, because you then get an idea of maybe older fishermen. You get an idea of what it was like. I think it's, you know, if you were going to do a project of some kind, you know, you probably would want to locate it in somewhere where there had been a healthy reef of some time, you know, or something existing. You want, I think, to try and kind of recreate something, you know, it'd be like you wouldn't want to put a forest in an area where there's no water. I mean, for one of a better example, if you're going to regenerate something, you certainly want to know that the place that you're regenerating is going to support the investment. So that's definitely one thing I would be looking into. I mean, if I was going to be doing one of my projects in your location, I would be looking towards to a dive community, because the dive community in essence is kind of an integral relationship to what we're doing. Yeah, and then I would find the team, and then I would find a location. The locations that you tend to want are kind of protected areas. You don't want to put in projects where the storms are going to damage it. And yeah, just I would find it. I mean, what an amazing project. I'd find a suitable location, and yeah, just find some local scientists who, you know, may not have tons of experience, but certainly have got some willing desire, and just bring it. I mean, I bring a team together, and yeah, just start to regenerate is what I would do. You know, establish and make sure there's nobody doing any harmful activities there. And what a great thing, you know.
Great, thanks.
Great. I think we'll end it there. Everyone's obviously got your website, Celia. Thank you so much. I suppose you're fairly open to people contacting you and possibly if a project arises, hiring you, even better. But yeah, we really
and also
appreciate
if anybody wants any
Go ahead.
recommendations, I can link you in with people if you wanted to go to Gili or some of these places. You know, if you wanted to, I mean, Gili, Tawang, and Delphine is doing an amazing job on the islands, and it's a great diving destination. It's super fun. Permuteran on the north of the island is another great location of a project. So, you know, if any of you did actually decide you wanted to go and do something in the field, I could definitely, you know, put you in touch with some people that would, you know, love to meet you and show you around and show you what they've done. So
cool. Is the best way to reach you through your website?
Yeah, through my email. Celia Gregory@mac.com.
Great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Yay.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
And we were blessed with good internet. I'm amazed. That was incredible.
Good. We really appreciate you, Celia, all the hard work you've done and your generosity to share it with us. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.